Good evening, world historians. Dr. Smith here. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Today, I'm just going to say a few words on revolution and nationalism. Nationalism, in fact, being one of the great ideas which emerges from the age of revolution. And when we think of revolution, we tend to think of 1776, Declaration of Independence, George Washington, and so on, because we're American. But in fact, if you look at the 18th, early 19th century, I think the case could be argued that the French Revolution has as much, if not even greater, far reaching implications for the world at the time. Partly that's because France, believe it or not, was considered a more powerful country in the 19th century. America, in its early years, was still a kind of a backward society. And secondly, the ideas that came out of the French Revolution were so violent, so radical, that they've actually left behind a whole legacy of the way that we talk about politics. For example, liberal, conservative, these are ideas which come out of the French Revolution. They actually had a slightly different meaning in the 19th century. French Revolution actually takes place in 1789, but continues really in its legacy throughout the 19th century. The word liberal and conservative nowadays in America, we use them in a particular sense. We tend to think of, maybe someone who watches MSNBC or Fox News, has a certain political affiliation or something of that nature. But in the 19th century, liberalism really meant a specific sort of package of ideas, belief in constitutionalism. In other words, the idea that everyone has rights which are demarked by the legal system. The idea of popular sovereignty, which we find obviously in the American Revolution, the we the people of the Constitution, but is very much in contrast to what we would think of as conservatism in the 19th century or 18th, 19th century European sense. Belief in tradition, belief in monarchy, belief in organized religion, particularly the privileges of the Catholic Church, and a belief in turning back almost the clock to where it was before 1789, before the storming of the Bastille and the beginning of the French Revolution. Now, of course, when anyone tries to turn back the clock in terms of history, they're always fighting against the tide. I think, even if we think about our own situation, with the coronavirus and the world crisis that we're going through at the moment, I think it would be very naive to imagine that things are going to return exactly as they were before this crisis began. And similarly, in 1789, what we're seeing is an unleashing, if you like, an uncorking of sort of almost a genie in the bottle, and a whole social reorganization which is taking place in the 19th century. The influence of the state, the centralized bureaucratic state, which is industrialized, which is militarized, which centralizes the power into the hands of what we would think of today as a sort of central government, as opposed to in the 18th century, even under the French monarchs, before the French Revolution, you see a great sort of spread actually of power in the hands of wealthy landed elites, and not so much the centralization of power and the move towards more sort of democratic representative government you start to see in the 19th century. Looking at this from a slightly Eurocentric perception as well, you also start to see in the age of the Industrial Revolution the impact of steam technology, fossil fuels, mass manufacturing, and imperialism in terms of gross domestic product. This is from the year 1700, where you see China, India, and Europe pretty much at the same stage of development 300 years ago. And yet over the course of 200 years, you see actually China increasing slightly and then decreasing sharply in relation to the rest of the world. Europe, because of the Industrial Revolution, escalating in GDP during the 19th century and through into the 20th century, and a slow, steady decline of GDP in India as a percentage of the world's total output. This is also, of course, in large part, reordering of the political world, which has to do with war, which has to do in particular with one man, Napoleon Bonaparte, who seized control of power in France during the Revolutionary Wars, which then become known as the Napoleonic Wars, plunge Europe into nearly total chaos. Of course, Napoleon Bonaparte I don't want to, defend his actions. He was responsible for more deaths in Europe than any other man up until the rise of Hitler and Stalin. However, his ambitions were in some ways ahead of their time. He wanted to create a united Europe, which would have a single legal system, which would have a single system of weights and measurements, a single tax system, a single, monetary system. So, in some ways, he's sort of anticipating the European Union. But the counter effects of his conquests in Europe during the late 19th, late 18th, early 19th centuries is to actually create a wave of nationalism in countries like Poland, Italy, and other countries which have the misfortune to have been invaded by the multinational French-led armies of Napoleon Bonaparte. A number of unintended consequences of this period are the demise or the beginnings of the end of the Spanish Empire, which had been founded, of course, way back in the 1490s by Christopher Columbus. The introduction of, as I mentioned before, a single legal system into Europe, the Code Napoleon, which is still used today in France, which was considered to be very radical for its time in terms of introducing ideas of property rights for women, divorce reform, social reform, which was way ahead of its time. In large parts of Europe as well, the Jewish minority population was oppressed by local, religious and civil law, and the Napoleonic period actually helps to emancipate the situation of the Jews in large parts of Europe, parts of Germany, parts even of Russia, and so the Jewish population in much of Europe consider Napoleon not as a conqueror but as an emancipator, as a liberator. And the other final point about Napoleon's reforms, ironically, because of course he styles himself as an emperor and makes many of his followers members of the aristocracy, but he also introduces this idea of meritocracy, the idea that you can get ahead through service to the state, through service to the Napoleonic army. Many of his generals, for example, were the children, the sons of lowly working class bakers, artisans, that kind of thing, who joined the army and rose up through the ranks. And so, as a result of Napoleon's conquest during the late 19th or 18th, early 19th century, the map of Europe is transformed. And what you see rising in its stead is this new idea, ironically an idea which Napoleon himself was opposed to, even though he was a French nationalist. He was attempting to create more of a European identity. And that is the idea of nationalism in the modern sense, which starts in Europe but will spread very rapidly throughout the world to the 20th century. This is something which is a sort of slippery concept because it has many different possible interpretations. Of course, when we think of nationalism at its darkest, most extreme form, we think obviously of the rise of fascism, ultimately the rise of Hitler and the Third Reich in World War II. But in the 19th century, it's worth noting that most nationalists, in Europe at least, consider themselves to be politically enlightened. They lent more towards the American Revolution than towards the later developments of the 20th century. So nationalism was defined by a number of different ways, many of which overlapped, neither of which was necessarily the only way of defining nationalism. In Germany and Italy, for example, in the 19th century, you see a move towards unified nation states based on common language. People in Europe who lived in different territories which spoke German or Italian started to identify more with each other than with their traditional kind of feudal identities. Ethnicity, of course, can be a way of understanding nationalism, but of course, in the case of the Third Reich, you can see how that can also be an exclusive and dangerous mentality. Religion, another way that we can think of nationalism, both historically and in the world today. And then finally, history, the idea of having a shared history, but also the ideas of history which are being shared, which are being spread through print culture, the development of newspapers, the development of literacy, the development of things like the railroads and the telegraph system, which we think of as being a throwback to the past, but the telegraph in the 1840s was the first medium of mass instant communication, and this has a magical effect in terms of spreading these ideas of nationalism and this idea of almost imagining oneself as being part of a greater sphere of identity. You have different forms of nationalism. Obviously, ethnic nationalism at its most extreme, which can blend in towards fascism and other forms of nationalism, though not necessarily. And then more like the American version, we tend not to talk about nationalism, but we tend to talk about patriotism, the idea of a civic nationalism, which is identified more by a common set of values and symbols, such as the Constitution, the Oath of Allegiance, the American flag. For example, we would consider ourselves in general to be a civic nation rather than ethnic nationalism. Finally, nationalism can also lead towards separatism, which we see in the American Civil War, for example, with the move towards separation, secession from the United States. But it can also lead towards a rebuilding or a re-strengthening of national ties. So the American Civil War would be a classic example of the separatist view of secessionism versus the unification or the reunification of the United States during the Abraham Lincoln administration. So these are all different terms, concepts that we can apply to this idea of nationalism. The point here is that it becomes really the dominant ideology of the 19th and, of course, into the 20th century, a very powerful ideology as well, and serves to replace, not just in theory but in practice, the idea of absolutism, the idea of absolute monarchism or absolute monarchies, which were the most widespread form of government in Europe and throughout much of the world before the French and Industrial Revolutions. And in fact, here we can see a portrait of poor old King Louis XVI of France, who ends up losing his head on account of the revolution. But under the terms of absolute monarchy, which exists today in very limited forms, we find it in places like Saudi Arabia and other countries, but it tends to be an exception rather than a rule. Before the French Revolution, before the industrial societies of the Industrial Revolution, absolute monarchy was a form of government where the monarch, the king, or the queen in some cases, controlled the right to make war, to tax, to judge, to coin money. In other words, the sovereignty of the state resided not in the people, but in the body of the sovereign, in other words, in the body of the monarch. There were only very few exceptions to that rule of thumb before the advent of the French Revolution. Of course, America would be one of them. But before that, you have to really go back all the way to ancient Greece, particularly Athens, where the ideas of democracy were first experimented, and Republican Rome, which would be the Roman Republic before it was taken over by Julius Caesar and becomes the Roman Empire. And then in the modern world at that time, there were very few notable exceptions. One of them was actually Switzerland, which might seem like an odd case, but many of the American and French revolutionaries took inspiration from Switzerland. Their critics said, well, Switzerland is just this small, landlocked, slightly eccentric republic in Central Europe. It doesn't really serve as a good example for the rest of the world because it's an exception rather than a rule. And this reminded me finally of a quote from a movie that, if you haven't seen, you should take use of the time available to watch The Third Man, starring Orson Welles. There's a great quote in this movie, sort of 1949 spy thriller. And Orson Welles' character compares Switzerland with Renaissance Italy. He says, in Italy for 30 years, they had warfare, terror, murder and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. And here I think Orson Welles is making, or his character is making a sort of rather astute observation, which was also reflected in the politics of the 19th century. Many people regarded the experiments of brotherly love and democracy that were taking place in Switzerland and more recently in America and France as being a great social experiment whose results would await the test of history. So that's where I'm going to leave you today. Thanks very much, and stay posted for more.